continue our walk through the gospel of Jesus. Speaking of Jesus, I bought a bunch of these Keep Jesus Brown bumper stickers, and you get to piss off white people for free. Take it. Like, take one. I bought them for that purpose. So please, they're all going. I'll order more. Awesome. There will be more next week. Maria suggested that. That was a great suggestion. But we're continuing this walk through the gospel of Jesus, which is a collection of the sayings and the events of the historical Jesus compiled by some of the world's most prominent theologians and historians, and we're just going to jump right in today. Our text reads, "Congratulations, you poor. God's empire belongs to you. Congratulations, you hungry. You will have a feast. Congratulations, you who weep now. You will laugh." And they would bring children to him so he could bless them with his hands, but the disciples scolded them. Then Jesus grew indignant when he saw this and said to them, "Let the children come up to me. Don't try to stop them. After all, God's empire belongs to people like these." Let me tell you, whoever doesn't welcome the empire of God the way a child would will never set foot in his empire. Someone's giving a big dinner and invited many guests. At the dinner hour, the host sent his slave to tell the guests, "Come, it's ready now." But one by one, they all began to make excuses. The first said to him, "I just bought a farm and I have to go and inspect it. Please excuse me." And another said, "Well, I just bought 5 pairs of oxen and I'm on my way to check them out. Please excuse me." And another said, "I just got married and so I can't attend." So the slave came back and reported these excuses to his master. And then the master of the house was outraged and instructed the slave, "Then go out into the roads and the country lanes and force people to come in so my house will be filled. For I'm telling you, not one of those who were invited will taste my dinner." And I don't know, maybe this guy could cook. That might be a bad thing not to be invited. All right, take a few moments, talk to each other about your observations, and we'll come back and share those with the group. All right. Hey, to interrupt, who wants to share? What did you discuss at your table? Be brave, step forward, please. We would love to hear what you have to say, because church is not all about this guy. It's about you too. Bernie.
You know, the other thing that's interesting about this one, you know, it's a much commented upon fact that you could, you know, start at Genesis 1 and look all the way through to Revelation 22, looking for any hint whatsoever that the various authors that created this work we call the Bible had anything negative to say about slavery. And this passage is yet another example of slavery just taken as a given, and without, you know, any kind of negative commentary. Of course, the master had a slave that he could go out and, you know, round up some poor people and bring into his bank. And, you know, Dan Savage, who's a podcaster that does a rather provocative, you know, sex podcast, you know, he frequently says, you know, if this most basic ethical norm, that there is indeed something wrong with slavery, if the entire holy book of Christianity is totally silent on it, you know, why don't we take this book to teach us anything? And, you know, I think that you can see his point.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that assessment, actually, and I had this conversation this week. It is so funny to me that fundamentalists are like, you can't change Scripture. God said it. The King's on it, the King's in it, and the King James, and you can't change a word because that's God's word. And then you ask them about slavery, they're like, "Oh, what, do you think slavery is okay?" Well, of course not. Well, the Bible never condemns it. So why is it appropriate to look at a cultural normative from hundreds of years ago and say, "Oh, that was back then, but of course we wouldn't apply it now because it's a horrific practice"? Why is it okay to do with slavery, but not okay to do with things like sexual identity and sexuality? Why is it not okay to do with, you know, different, you know, styles of marriage? Like, obviously the Bible doesn't have a coherent message on that whatsoever, but why is it that you think your one interpretation that you've been taught your whole life cannot be questioned or examined? That's a beautiful, beautiful observation. So good stuff, I love it. Now for me, the first observation, I'm just going to move straight down, and it's pretty self-explanatory. This new world that Jesus had in mind will elevate the status of the poor, the marginalized, the afflicted, and the oppressed. And this means, if you hear nothing else from my sermon today, that authentic Christianity always eliminates injustice the moment it manifests itself, and it works tirelessly until these toxic cultural values are eliminated. That's number one. And when you say things like that, occasionally you get pushback from others, usually like the centrist moderates that want to love everybody. Yeah, but what about loving your enemies, man? Like, you can love your enemies and fight to make sure that white supremacy is federally outlawed. Which, you know, I wrote this before this happened. DHS finally labeled white supremacists as the most significant terroristic threat in this country. And I just gotta say, it's about damn time. But I digress. But we can love our enemies, right? And seek for the 1% to pay a 70% marginal tax rate without exception. We can love our enemies and stand for the working class to be paid a living wage with one job. We can love our enemies and demand that housing is affordable. We can love our enemies and implement changes for the environment to be restored while also making sure that the corporations that destroyed our home, that they front the bill for the destruction of our planet and they repair the damages done and are held to account. We are capable of multitasking in the church, and we can love enemies while protecting the helpless and defending our home. That is the basis of authentic Christianity. I dropped the mic, but it's on stand. Moving on to the next passage, we see that Jesus. They are expensive. I need a cheap one to drop just on this side. Moving on to the next passage, we see that Jesus includes children in this movement. Now, children at this time were seen as silent participants in temple life during the time of Christ, and today the children are not always raised in religious homes. Oftentimes, kids and teenagers are seen as incapable of leadership and of commencing a movement that would bring about change. And those that would agree with this lowly view of younger generations have obviously never seen the Parkland students. Skeptical older generations are damn sure mistaken when they underestimate the influence of young activists like Greta Thunberg. Yeah, by the way, if you've got a glass, let's raise a glass to Greta Thunberg this week. She's not old enough to drink yet, but when she's 21, we gotta buy her a beer, because that kid is a rock star. Now, moving on, we see an analogy of a feast. And at first, the people that were privileged in society were given an invitation to attend, which usually, that's the custom that's, in place during that time. You got a big feast with expensive food, you're going to invite a bunch of wealthy people. But the Gospel of Matthew changes the event that was mentioned in Luke to a royal wedding, and that further hones in on the fact that the likely intended message of this pericope of text is that those that were initially invited to the feast in this parable were of high social ranking. These wealthy members of society rejected the invitation in the parable, and the invitation is then forced, like Ali pointed out, on those of lowly status. Now, at best as I can tell from this week's research, I think this was a metaphor presented in the text, and it's this. Those who benefit from corruption of this world will rarely accept an invitation to create a planet in which they do not exclusively reap a reward. Yet so many people believe this fairy tale about wholesome members of the 1%. And what's worse is that poor liberals and conservatives rally to their aid to defend their oppressors vocally. They'll create jobs. They're the backbone of our economy. It's ridiculous. It's the equivalent of slugs campaigning for table salt. That's the ridiculousness of this argument. It makes zero sense whatsoever. Anyway, moving on. Notice that there's also a sense of urgency in this metaphor. Those that were on the margins are forced to participate because the ruling class likely never will on their own. They're not going to do it. So if you're waiting for rich people to fix the planet, I got bad news for you. It's not going to happen. If you're waiting for rich people to fix the economy and pay workers what they're justly owed, have they done it so far? If love could have done it, it would have already changed. Love implies action, not warm fuzzies and thoughts and prayers. So, there is a sense of urgency in this text, and I believe it applies today, that if we're going to cultivate this new world that Jesus was talking about, we've got to put hands and feet to love. even if we don't want to. And maybe we need a kick in the pants sometimes to get this thing started. So I think there should be a collective sense of urgency about things like our economy collapsing, and definitely about the climate crisis that we've been going through and turning a blind eye to. Amen? Amen. All right, now with these observations in mind, continue the dialogue with one another, and we'll get back in just a moment or two. So who wants to share some of their observations, specifically on an application for today's discussion? Yes? No, you're okay.
I'm getting Carly away from me, so my mouth is a little bit. But there's a couple of things that I was telling them. It makes me think of the fact that people, like probably 6 months ago, were really excited that Jeff Bezos was giving less than 1% of his billions of dollars to charity. Because they're like, oh, it's so much money, and I'm like, it's so much money to you, it's nothing to him. But they said that, and then, what is it, 2 weeks ago, he cut all of his benefits for his workers?
Yep.
And Whole Foods isn't union. It's why my aunt didn't go there from the grocery store she works at, even though they were paying money. It's not union. So until they unionize, which my mother believes they will, and I hope that they will, they can't collectively bargain. And then the other thing that I told them is I've been teaching the French Revolution lately.
Nice.
And we have it worse than they did, except for we're not starving. I mean, some people are, but the 97% of people aren't starving. And I have friends in a political punk rock group, and they have a lyric where it's McDonald's is cheap, but if people don't starve, the revolution won't happen.
That's a brilliant tactic. Yeah, that's good. That's a great observation. And by the way, we've missed you so much. I'm glad you're here. Yeah. All right, who else? Two more. Yes?
We had a question about the little things on either side of his empire there in the brackets.
So some of the brackets are the theologian's way of saying that it's inferring. It's like, it doesn't actually mention that, but it's like kind of saying like, meaning this. So not specifically stated, but it implies that it's referring to something else, if that makes sense.
But then we went on to talk about how there are some who would believe that like the free market will take care of everything, and that the whole trickle-down theory, and that if we just leave things to people, that they'll make sure that the planet is polluted or the water is clean. That we don't need all those government regulations, and it's right in keeping with what you were saying about.
I agree with that. I agree with that 100%, and I love that it's called trickle-down economics, because there is something trickling on everybody, and it's not money. It's not rain either. You still need it. All right, one more. Once, going twice. Yes.
I have another thing to say.
Oh, please do.
I missed a lot of church. I'm making up for it. I actually got into an argument with someone that used to work with my mother on Facebook. I know, really surprising that I got into an argument on Facebook. I keep inviting Christopher into my arguments on Facebook in fact. But the whole thing started with somebody saying, if you don't vote, don't complain. Which, my response to that was, so my students can't complain because they're 15.
Yeah.
They can't vote. Yes. So my friend Kelly can't complain. She's Canadian. She lives here though. She lives in Scotts Valley. She's not allowed to complain because she can't vote. It's more than that.
Yep.
And it's that things can change, and everyone is worth listening to, at least for a little bit.
Yeah. And what about the folks, that have been here for years and contributed to our economy, but they can't get the citizenship ball rolling because it takes forever? I saw a documentary the other day, a little snippet, that it was like 18 years before this person could be considered for citizenship, and then it was like 10 years after that. So it's not always easy.
And thousands of dollars.
And yes, exactly.
There was one I recently read where it was 22 years to wait for the paperwork. And the person that was going for it Like, he died before he got the chance to become the justice.
It's times like these where I think we should call this what it is. And I don't like using this word usually, but it's sin. Flat out, it is sin. We need to acknowledge it. We don't need to sugarcoat it to make other people comfortable because we don't need to discuss it. We need to call it out. Yes?
Well, they charge a bunch of people that are African American, especially as convicted felons, so that they can vote.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but as well.
Yeah. It's wrong. It's a corrupt system. And speaking of which, this week in preparation for Sunday, the fierce urgency of now. It really stood out to me this week as the climate crisis protests began to erupt around the globe. Yes, flat earthers, I said globe. Jesus Christ, and our species, I swear. Anyway, at the helm of this movement was a young lady. I'm going to acknowledge her again, Greta Thunberg. And this young woman is an absolute boss. And in honor of the passages we read today that teach us to recognize the potential in today's youth, I'd like to read a section of her speech today, if that's okay with y'all. She said this: I also have a dream that governments, political parties, and corporations grasp the urgency of the climate and ecological crisis and come together despite their differences, as you would in any emergency, and take the measures required to safeguard the conditions for a dignified life for everyone on earth. Because then we millions of school-striking youth could actually go back to school. I have a dream that the people in power, as well as the media, start treating this crisis like the existential emergency that it is, so that I can go home to my sister and my dogs because I missed them. In fact, I have many dreams, but this is 2019. This is not the time and place for dreams. This is the time and place for us to wake up. This is the moment in history where we need to be wide awake. And yes, we need dreams. We cannot live without dreams, but there's a time and a place for everything, and dreams cannot stand in the way of telling it like it is. And yet, wherever I go, I seem to be surrounded by fairy tales. Business leaders, elected officials, all across the political spectrum, spending their time making up and telling bedtime stories that soothe us and that make us go back to sleep. These are the feel-good stories about how we're going to fix everything, how wonderful everything is going to be when we have solved the climate crisis. But the problem we are facing is not that we lack the ability to dream or to imagine a better world. The problem now is that we need to wake up. It's time to face the reality, to face the facts, to face the science. And the science doesn't mainly speak of great opportunities to create the society we always wanted. It tells of unspoken human suffering, which will get worse and worse the longer we delay action, unless we start to act now. And yes, of course, a sustainable, transformed world will include lots of new benefits. But you have to understand, this is not primarily an opportunity to create new green jobs, or new businesses, or green economic growth. This is above all an emergency, and not just any emergency. This is the biggest crisis humanity has ever faced. And we need to treat it accordingly so that people can understand and grasp the urgency, because you cannot solve a crisis without treating it like a crisis. Stop telling people that everything will be fine when in fact, as it looks now, it won't be fine. This is not something you can package and sell or click like on social media. Stop pretending that you, your business idea, your political party, or your plan will solve everything. We must realize that we don't have all the solutions yet. Far from it. Unless those solutions mean that we simply stop doing certain things. And changing one disastrous energy source for a slightly less disastrous energy source, I think she's talking about methane, is not progress. Exporting our emissions overseas is not reducing our emissions. Creative accounting will not help us. In fact, it's the heart of the problem. And that means that richer countries need to do their fair share and get down to zero emissions fast, so that people in poorer countries can heighten their standard of living by building some of the infrastructure that we already have built, such as roads, hospitals, schools, access to clean drinking water, and electricity. The USA is the biggest carbon polluter in history. It is also the world's #1 producer of oil, and yet, you are also the only nation in the world that has signaled your strong intention to leave the Paris Agreement. Because, quote, it was a bad deal for the USA. 420 GT of CO2 left to emit as of January of 2018. Now that figure is already down to less than 360 GT. These numbers are very uncomfortable. But people have the right to know, and the vast majority of us have no idea that these numbers even exist. In fact, not even the journalists that I have met seem to know that they even exist, not to mention the politicians. And yet they all seem so certain that their political plan will solve the entire crisis. But how can we solve a problem that we don't fully understand? How can we leave out the full picture in the current best available science? I believe there is a huge danger in doing so. And no matter how political the background to this crisis may be, we must not allow this to continue to be a partisan political question. The climate and ecological crisis is beyond party politics. And our main enemy right now is not our political opponents. Our main enemy now is physics, and you can't make deals with physics. She goes on to say this. Everybody says that making sacrifices for the survival of the biosphere and to secure the living conditions for future and present generations is an impossible thing to do. But Americans have indeed made great sacrifices to overcome terrible odds before. Think of the brave soldiers that rushed ashore in the first wave on Omaha Beach on D-Day. Think of Martin Luther King and the 600 other civil rights leaders who risked everything to march from Selma to Montgomery. Think of President John F. Kennedy announcing in 1962 that America would choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things not because they're easy, but because they're hard. Perhaps it's impossible, but looking at those numbers, looking at the current and best available science signed by every nation, then I think the impossible is precisely what we are up against. But you must not spend all of your time dreaming or see this as some political fight to win, and you must not gamble your children's future on the flip of a coin. Instead, you must unite behind the science. You must take action behind the science. You must do the impossible behind the science, because giving up can never, ever be an option. Church, can we give this rock star one more round of applause? Greta is a young teenager with Asperger's that is taking a stand because she must. She has very little resources at her disposal. She has mountains of adversity. She has legions of enemies and adversaries, and yet she stands not because she wants to, but because she doesn't have a choice. So my question to all of us that do have a choice is this: will we stand with her and with our planet to make sure that our youth today can secure a tomorrow? That's what I want you to take to communion today. And you're welcome to take this whether you're a Christian or not. You're welcome to partake in this ceremony that's going to signify our collective embrace of grasping the urgency of now and putting hands and feet to that knowledge to make a difference in this world that is literally on fire. And until next week, may the peace of the Lord Christ go with you wherever it may send you. May it guide you through the wilderness and protect you through the storms. May it bring you home rejoicing at the wonders that it shows you, and may it bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. Grace and peace to you.